along right after the Falling series, and there wasn't any break between doing that short series and the Falling series before it. Cold Mountain combines a lot of ideas that I had been working with over the years. The term, or the title, Cold Mountain, is in reference to the Cold Mountain poems of Han Shan. I had read those, particularly the translations of Gary Snyder and some others too. And they have to do with austerity, being losing one's ego and retreating or retiring to the mountains, the cold mountains, psychologically, not being in the midst of worldly affairs, not being attached. And as a painter, I had tried to deal with this issue of how much I was involved. Me, the maker, the thinker, and I found that I liked, or I felt good about getting out of the way as much as I could of this process, which at its source was mysterious, or is mysterious, and I never was quite sure exactly what I was doing, because I didn't place a logical framework around my painting. I just sort of allowed it to be and to come along, and trusted that some of this mysterious impulses would energize the painter. So part of that exploration was, we talked about earlier, was in the Oriental card game series, where I used chance operations to determine color, placement of color, and so on. So when I got through with the Falling series, I felt like I had gone far enough in that, but I still liked the idea of pouring the paint and the idea of a deformed surface, not a flat surface, but a surface with some sort of topography. And I also was drawn back to this notion of chance operations, and also I had done quite a bit of pouring paint on unstretched canvas and shaping it, and I found that I liked the return to this stretched canvas format. It just felt to me more where I wanted to be. Because the unstretched canvases were ultimately meant to be stretched in there, to be exhibited. So for a lot of these impulses and reasons, I decided to stretch the canvas again and find ways to work with these ideas of pouring, random chance operations, and so on. So what I did was stretch the canvas. This was unprimed canvas, and then had it on the floor, and utilizing the Book of Random Numbers, or a page from the Book of Random Numbers, which is a book of numbers that was generated. I think the Rand Corporation did this years ago. It's just digits from 0 to 9, randomly displayed across in lines, and so many per page. And I utilized that to get me out of the decision-making process of in this painting, in this series of paintings as much as possible. So the first thing that I did was to use the full set of numbers, 0 through 9, to determine positions on the canvas, like latitude and longitude, of where something was going to happen, whether there'd be some paint or there wouldn't be some paint. And that determined positions. And in those, well, first of all, even before that, the positions I determined were where I was going to deform the canvas. That was the first thing. And then from beneath, I would put things underneath the canvas to create a topography of hills and valleys and so on. And then the next stage was to decide where the paint was going to be poured. And that was through this latitude-longitude process again. And then, so that didn't necessarily conform to where the peaks or valleys were. It was played across that landscape. Then the next choice was color. And I'd choose 10 colors, and then through this random selection process, I would marry a color to a position. And then the next decision to make was the direction of the pour. Which way would it go? And up, down, or left, right, so on. And then how much? The volume of paint. A little bit, a lot, and so on. So all these decisions were made in as the best I could in a random way, so that I wasn't. I was setting the overall framework, but within it, a lot of decisions were being made through this random process. And then it came time to actually paint, which meant mixing the paint according to the quotes instructions I had received, and then I poured it. And the painting canvas was flat on the floor, except it was deformed. And so that was the general process that I went through, and sort of taking a lot of myself out of the process of decision making, yet still the maker of the work, still crafting it, still actually painting it, you see. So there's a lot to that I won't get into now, but that's the basic thrust of that ideas around that Coal Mountain series. The result is that the paintings appear to be in free space, that there's no hint as to the earth or gravity or horizon or anything like that. They because the paint goes off in different directions. It appears to me to be a clear free space, unencumbered with a particular gravity Coal Mountain series. The result is that the paintings appear to be in free space, that there's no hint as to the earth or gravity or horizon or anything like that. They because the paint goes off in different directions. it appears to me to be a clear free space, unencumbered with a particular gravity, or might say many gravities. And I like that sense of being in space. That's aesthetically, it feels good to me. So that's the general direction of those paintings. There weren't too many of them, and they were the last of that series of poured paintings, and this was in the mid-70s, I believe. And at that time, I was doing a lot of other things, and my actual painting, slowed down, and I didn't get back to painting and drawing until maybe about 5 years later, about 1980 or so, 79, 80. When I came back to this getting back into my fine artwork, I believe I was drawing, and I have always liked drawing. I could be a pretty good draftsman. I've done a lot of technical drawing, and I've done, I can draw perspectives, and I've done life drawing, and if I put my mind to it and my hand to it, I'm a pretty fair draftsman, in both the technical sense and in fine art sense. But that leads to some of my feelings about what I'm about as an artist, as a painter. And that is, I'm not particularly interested in depicting nature, depicting what's called realism, objects, things, scenes, landscapes, still lives, and so on, even figure. That I've never felt that my function as a painter was primarily to make a picture of something, but rather to create the something, that this painting was what it was about. The object, the paint, the imagery, or of the painting was the subject. It wasn't about something else. So there was a time when I thought that so-called realistic, or realism, or realistic painting was much more abstract than what we normally term abstract painting, or non-objective painting, because the non-objective painting, the so-called abstract painting, was dealing with the paint, with the process, with the immediate form that was emerging, responding to it in a spontaneous way, and not referencing, let's say, that landscape or that still life or that figure. And
sorry, can you repeat kind of the last three sentences, because I looked a little soft, but I went into focus. That was such an important line.
yeah,
The idea
well,
that
yeah,
abstraction is more real than.
yeah. Well, I'll go back into this as this question of abstraction and reality. What I was saying was that there was a time when I used to think about this issue of realism in painting and abstraction or non-objective painting, and occurred to me in that meditation that that so-called realistic painting, realism, was really more abstract than abstract or non-objective painting. Because in so-called realism, or real, what we look at and say, oh, that's realism because it looks like something, you have abstracted from a scene information and then symbolized it on a canvas and said, this has something to do with that over there. When they're not, you know, they're not at all the same thing. This is paint over here, and that's a river and a tree there, you see. And so that's pretty abstract, you know, when you think about it. And when, but as a non-objective painter working with color and some of the things I've done, it doesn't reference something out there, the tree and the river, the person, the figure. It's more or less self-referencing. It's right here and now. It is the object. Everything is here in this painting. It isn't. You don't have to think about something else and say, oh, that looks like a haystack or that looks like a tree. Isn't that a beautiful sky? You know, it isn't like that. Each individual comes to the painting and says, has an association maybe. They say, oh, it looks like a parachute, or it looks like something. I think that's a kind of a limitation in seeing, because the person is putting a sort of filter between seeing what's actually there and themselves, so that they have to make it into an association of something. And then, oh, how much does it look like that? Well, that's a very abstract process. So anyway, that's the thoughts I had about abstraction and realism. So I've never been that interested in my painting world to depict something outside of the painting, although I have done that. If I put my mind to it, like I said, I can do pretty fair in that direction, but it wasn't, somehow that really wasn't my central interest. So it's I don't know how to, I think that the general impulse of moving the way I have in my painting life has been more parallel to a spiritual life, a religious activity, something like that. It's more in that realm than it is in a narrower worldly sense. It's tied into some kind of inner drive, inner feelings, inner impulses that tie the movement through painting towards some sort of spiritual impulse, and that's probably closer to the truth for me. Not something one can explain completely, but I like to think that when a painting felt right, that I'd gotten some poetry, a little bit of the poetry in there. So anyway, there was this break, and I moved to the after a while, after actually being I was traveling for a while. I was homeless for a while, lived in a tent for a while, did some interesting things, and then I ended up over on the First Avenue in Santa Cruz and Seabright area, in a small place which I lived for quite a number of years, and converted into a studio and living space, and it was right by the beach, which I loved, and did quite a bit of work there. And like I said, I started to draw again and included myself in a couple life drawing groups, and found myself wanting to work in the studio again, and kind of musing about how to begin. It always seems to me a bit arbitrary where one begins, and somehow, and I don't know how this worked, maybe it's my experience in architecture, thinking as an architect, or a desire for structure or something familiar, but I was looking through windows of my place, and I just saw that as a starting place, a framework in which to begin to draw and to use color. And so I started to make sketches and paintings on paper that were directly coming out of looking at the windows around me and the different light. And I began to notice that, and it's nothing new, many painters have noticed this, that the light changes, and the whole, within that framework, it all changes constantly. So you have this sort of infinite source of visual images that is never the same, because the light is always changing. And so you look through the window at 9 in the morning, and it's looks like one scene, and you look at half an hour later, it's changed, and so on through the day. So I realized that this was a kind of priming the pump for me to just study these window scenes and to make some sort of statement out of it. And so a series of paintings that were on paper and acrylic, pencil, came out of that inquiry. And it wasn't too long before I realized that I really wanted to get larger again. There's something in me that likes to be facing a field, an open field, space, and not feel like it's a thing in front of me with borders, but that there's a field. And I think that has something to do with the scale that I've worked at, which is, it seems to me, a minimum for me is what I can reach out full width when I'm standing next to the painting, and something that's a little taller than me, about my height, maybe a little bit taller, maybe another 6 inches or so. So I've done a lot of paintings about that scale, because when I move up to the painting, and I'm looking at it close, or painting, when I'm painting on it, I really don't see the edges that much. And there's something in that that is important to me. Like I don't know exactly what that is, but I like that sense of space. Anyway, that's the paintings. I began to make stretchers that size, and I decided that I wanted to bring back the crafting of the painting more in a conventional sense. You think of a painter painting with a paintbrush and standing in front of a painting and back and forth looking at it, walking to it, and back and forth, and mixing paint and so on. And I felt a need to move a little bit more in that direction. So I made these stretchers and started working at that scale, and I started to use ground on the painting again, gesso. And usually a light gesso, not really heavy, but usually water it down a little bit and work it into the canvas. So that there was some texture, because I still like that sense of the paint that I had, that the soaking of the paint into the canvas, the two becoming one physically. I liked that, and so I didn't want to give that up completely, but painting, with the painting vertical and what I had in mind required that the paint have something to work against. The staining wasn't going to work. So it was a kind of in-between place. And I started on enlarging on this window idea, just let it get bigger. And the first few paintings had some vestiges of sense of window. And gradually we moved through that to a place where it became something else. That series became something else. It transcended the starting place, a window. I even, at that point, experimented again with oil paints. I hadn't used oils for a long time. And I'd started as a painter using oils and then abandoned them for acrylics pretty early on. But I thought I liked the certain quality about oil paint that has a certain feeling to it and I'd looked at some oil paintings that I liked and thought, well, you can't do that in acrylics, it just doesn't come out like that. So I tried at it working with oil paint, but I'm painting on these big areas and they're light washes, they require a lot of thinning and so on, and the fumes were too much. It was too uncomfortable using that. So I abandoned that and went back to acrylic, and basically the Santa Cruz series began then, and it was a building up of a lot of transparent layers of acrylic paint. And there was some structuring. Sometimes I would draw a little bit, and you can see evidences of pencil lines and so on. And the paintings, I kind of like that evidence of process in there. I wouldn't try to cover it up. Things would remain or they wouldn't. And then paint out something and paint in something, and started working in that way. It's a lot of things going on. Still, color was, I was making most decisions, I believe, were primary still of color, but a lot of structure there, a lot of structure that I was bringing in line and dividing up the canvas in different ways, and you'd see a horizontal line maybe that would give a sort of horizon or a frame, or these things were going on. One of the things that happened was I was always kind of down on power lines and telephone lines, going across the sky. Where I live I seem like all these lines, all these power lines, and one day I was looking out that east window and I noticed that the lines out there, because of where the sun was, were all turning kind of gold, and I just saw them differently. I just saw them as part of the sky, just a line in the sky, and just as well in outer space as close by. And when I started seeing these lines like that, I started including them in the paintings. And then I started noticing how they change colors. With the backlight, how dark they were, and then with the light in the late afternoon, how they might turn a silver or gold or something like that. And so I'd started incorporating those kind of lines into the paintings, and didn't offer any resistance in myself to them. And they became like an ally in creating these works. Another thing that happened along in the early stages of this Santa Cruz series was that I noticed there was a diagonal line in one of the panels of the colors in there. And I've done a lot of drawing. I've taught, perspective drawing. I've done conventional perspective drawing and so on. And but it's not new to me to realize that when you put a line in at an angle, it creates a sense of perspective. And I hadn't been that interested in painting to introduce that illusion. But I noticed that this diagonal line was very powerful, and if one allowed one's visual vision to just kind of relax and go with it, different things happened. It could turn into a space with this line going back on say a plane. Just turn a flat panel of color into a plane going back into space just by putting this diagonal line in. You could also define that area rather than around the edges, it could be just defined by the diagonal line going from this corner to that corner. And some other thoughts and other things came up. So that kind of interested me, and so I started noticing that the diagonals that were cropping up in my painting. And so after a few paintings, I started to give them more importance, just for themselves. Not saying that they had to be anything or do anything, but they just were more important. And then a little further along the line, I said, well, why don't I just let those diagonals take over in a sense, and rather than say defining a square or a rectangle, almost a square in a painting, the whole painting, but just coming in a little bit and creating some sort of maybe drawn line that's a rectangle or a square, but define it with the diagonals and just let the diagonals do what the outline does. And so I started working with that idea and sort of letting the outline sort of fade away, the outer perimeter, and letting the diagonals start to take over in defining this space, maybe this square. And but rather than just drawing an X like that, I started painting